Welcome to WOMAD TV, everybody. My name is Melanie Daly, and I will be presenting with my friend James the eye disorders, the new medical treatment guidelines for the eyes. Thank you for being my friend today, James.
Oh, you're welcome.
We unfortunately I cannot get the song to work, but we did want to credit Leah again. She sang a wonderful song for our WOMAD TV presentations, but next time we will have that running for you.
And just a quick reminder, everybody, that this presentation is for informational purposes only and does not constitute the creation of an attorney-client relationship, even though many of you are very bright and very thoughtful and already are our clients. And of course, nothing we say today is legal advice, but of course, you may use it in the course of your practice into helping us and working with us in defending workers' compensation claims. So without further ado, I turn it back over to my friend and our host, Melanie.
Thank you. All right, so the purpose of these guidelines are to address any treatment to eye disorders that occur in the workplace. These can include traumatic eye injuries like blunt trauma or a foreign body in the eye. It can be eye diseases, occupational diseases that result in the eyes, and also any sort of bacterial infections or potential allergies, things that are caused by the environment. Or if, in the case of bacterial or viral, somebody catches it from somebody else that's working there. The definitions as for the eye injuries are acute, subacute, chronic, and postoperative. So acute is generally less than a month of the injury. Subacute is the injury of 1 to 3 months, and the chronic, when talking about the occupational diseases, that is more than 3 months. So, as far as eye disorders, the risk and causation of workers who are getting these injuries they're pretty non-controversial because it's pretty clear when there's an eye injury in the beginning. And also, the mechanism of injury is typically acute. It is noticeable and readily discernible, such as something that entered the eye. The symptoms start pretty immediately. It's watering eyes, red eyes, pain, which we'll talk about more later. But this is not really something that typically is able to, be made up. If something happened to the eye, it's pretty clear. Upon the initial assessment of the eye treatment, it focuses on detecting any indicators of foreign bodies in the eye or potentially serious injury or disease. These red flags, they call them, can lead to blindness if not treated properly. So they first assess whether there are any red flags. Red flags, according into the guidelines, are typically disorders that can really potentially occupationally related injuries. The mechanism of injury provides the most important information. Ocular injuries, closed globe, thermal burns, like if somebody gets a burn in the eye, radiation, chemical burns, things that could really do some damage on the eyesight.
Melanie, before we move on, I want to say I looked through the early sections of these treatment guidelines, and their description of the process of conducting an examination is like extraordinarily more detailed than what we've encountered in any of the other medical treatment guidelines, like the sort of general principles about how to assess a condition. And when I read through them, I noticed that, they said what you described, which is, most eye injuries, causation is very non-controversial, very clear, like, somebody got punched in the eye, somebody got something in their eye at work, somebody was exposed to a chemical at work, something like that. But I was thinking about sort of the more mundane things that we ordinarily experience with our eyes. And I was thinking also about the carpal tunnel guidelines, because remember when the carpal tunnel guidelines came out, there was a lot of controversy about it because they gave lots of descriptions and guidelines about how doctors should find causation. And so I was sort of reading these ones with an eye to that. And the only thing I saw that was of any note was in the description of eye infections, basically like conjunctivitis and all that other stuff. And they basically said, like, unless it is obvious, it is unclear the causation, right? So I'm like, because I'm thinking that's got to be the most common thing, right? It's just like an eye
Right.
irritation of unknown cause, right? When somebody gets pink eye or some kind of conjunctivitis or whatever, and the best the guidelines could say is, you should be taking a detailed explanation from the patient of what they do at work, what their work activities entail, and what they have been exposed to or not at work. But so for the most common thing that you'd expect to see, which I guess maybe they're just claims that aren't filed. I don't know. You like get an
Right.
eye infection, nobody thinks to claim it as a work condition. I don't know. Anyway, it was just, I thought it was interesting. There's literally 19 pages of sort of preamble to the doctors, like telling these guys how to do their jobs.
Right.
And I just have to wonder too, New York spends all this time creating these specific guidelines. I wonder that this information doesn't exist somewhere already. Like we have our own disability guidelines, but the ADA has a perfectly good set of them. We have our own medical treatment guidelines, but there are standards of care and practice. So
Right.
I'm wondering what was trying to be accomplished here. And I was also wondering, why was this a priority? Right?
Right.
Like,
I agree.
it's like we've handled, I don't know, Melissa handled one eye claim that I can remember, and I think we've had two others in the office in the course of 10 years. And like causation wasn't controversial, treatment wasn't controversial. The only thing that was controversial was permanency and restriction.
Right. That's what I found. I was looking through the cases, and there's not a lot of on causation. It's mainly loss of use and
Right.
what it's attributed to or not.
Right. You'd think if they were going to put out guidelines, it should have been clarification on like how do you find out, like what we should be paying for these losses. Anyway,
Right.
allocation of resources is not why we're here. Sorry. I wanted to rant about this. Go ahead.
So the red flags, as long as there are no red flags, then they can move on to the actual treatment and ascertaining what is wrong with the eye. So the goals are the optimal medical care, monitoring the eye for complications, facilitating the healing process, assisting stay at work or early return. I did notice it said that most, as long as they're not serious, the eye injuries, they pretty much return to work pretty quickly. Occupational factors should be addressed also, like what sort of environment they are returning to, whether that would aggravate the eye further, and prevention measures should also be addressed when exists, such as probably safety goggles or whatever, depending on the occupational environment. So focus is detecting on red flags, determine the accurate diagnosis. And again, the red flags are the potentially serious that can result in blindness, and then they are safely treated according to the injury. So the clinical pathology for the eyes is the acute injury or event, which would be your typical blunt trauma or something injuring the eye, or ocular diseases, which there are several mentioned that we'll discuss later. And there's actually a case on one of those that was interesting. So we included that also. They take the history of the claimant's eyes, and if there's any prior treatment, any prior injuries, any bacterial or viral infections. That viral infections, typically they're dormant and then they pop back up. So if they have a history of those, that's obviously important to determine causation. And the diagnostic approach, the clinical thought process from the mechanism of illness or injury to unique symptoms and signs of the particular disorder, and then test results if available. So if it is pink eye, typically, I forget how they do the testing for that, but they just, if it is a virus or bacterial, they obviously test it to make sure that they're going to administer the correct treatment. And also the accurate diagnoses depends on linking the mechanism of injury to the symptoms, signs, findings of the eye examination. And if needed, then they do the staining of the eye to get a better look at it. And also some of the symptoms that occur in eye injuries, they ascertain whether there is blurred vision. That can mean it's a serious ocular disease, or if it improves with blinking, then it's more likely a discharge or mucus on the surface. Severe pain is something obviously that they take into consideration pretty seriously. Photophobia, abnormal sensitivity to light. So iritis, keratitis, and ulcers, they are the type of things that are under that category. Or if somebody's pupils are dilated, then that obviously would create the same photophobia sensitivity.
Can I just say that iritis sounds like something that somebody just made up?
I know.
I have
Some of
iritis.
these,
I have bonitis. I have fingeritis. That's so weird. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
no, that's okay. And some of these conditions may occur alone or secondary as a result of corneal inflammation. And then colored halos is the rainbow-like fringes or colored halos seen around a point of light, which also creates blurred vision. But when you're looking at the lights and they can see that rainbow, then that is also something that they would look at in determining how to treat and what is wrong with it. It's a danger symptom which suggests acute glaucoma. And also the exudation, the typical result of conjunctival eyelid inflammation or itching, which is most commonly just allergies, or that can be associated with the pink eye. And they also look at the claimant's visuals, whether they can have any vision loss. They do an eye exam. That's for a wide range of purposes, and that can be covered in any eye injury that's administered. Or color vision screening, that is focused when there is a requirement to see colors in the occupation. So if somebody, it's really dependent on what the job is. And also peripheral vision testing. So if they are having problems with their peripheral vision and they have tunnel vision, then that is something that they test for in events, in occupations that require safety concerns. Like if you need to see somebody coming up next to you, or you need to know whether an object is coming in. A lot of construction workers would obviously need this for the equipment. And then also depth perception testing. So they didn't really hone in much. They just kind of gave a general explanation of when these tests are administered or important, screening and diagnostics. I think peripheral vision is important anyway.
It's probably Cheryl.
And the other, the next issue that can come up is the foreign bodies, rust rings, which I never really knew much about, or corneal abrasions. And the risk factors for this type of injury is somebody who works in metalwork or construction. Presumably, they would be wearing safety goggles or some sort of eye protection, but this is where the foreign bodies get into the eye, such as rust or bricks, little pieces that can get into the eye. And this is one of the scenarios where the causation would be rarely at issue, is the onset of symptoms generally happens right away. And then the corneal abrasions are well known to occur in the perioperative and intensive care settings due to the lack of protective reflexes. So, common symptoms of the foreign body sensation, as we all know, is your eye starts to water. That's even when you just get an eyelash in your eye starts watering. So it's very acute symptoms. Pain usually occurs. This is especially true if there is an abrasion. Tearing, redness, photophobia, visuals, usually preserved. Visual is usually preserved unless the visual axis is affected. Okay, and this is another situation where they would see whether there were any red flags present at the time of initial evaluation to make sure that there's no other steps they would have to take to prevent a serious complication with the eyes. All right, and the initial assessment, visual acuity may be impaired, particularly if visual access is involved with injury or injury is extensive. So if it's heavy tearings in the eye, then the eye exam should ensue, finding inspection, including redness, tearing, or difficulties in the eye. All right, this is a rust ring. So I've never seen one of those before. It usually goes along with the foreign body entrance into the eye, and it creates that like abrasion or an ulcer type thing into the eye.
Gross.
I know. There were a lot of gross pictures in this preparation that I decided to spare everyone, well, mainly myself, because I can't do the eye abrasions. So diagnostic recommendations is they do the visual testing, the x-rays, and CT scans or MRIs. The CT scans give a little more detailed information than the x-rays, and also the MRIs show whether there's any internal damage with the eyes. And the treatment recommendations for a foreign body removal is initially the copious irrigation. So they just take one of these and they rinse out the eye and get it out. So they also use a cotton swab or a needle or a magnet if it's a case where something would come out using magnetic, and the removal of the rust ring. All right, and the medications, this is not, this is typical for all eye injuries, not only acute, but also the chronic. They have a lot of different medications, which we are going to go over, but a lot of them are antibiotics or drops, antifungal, and then epidermal growth factor, artificial tears, and topical ointments that they put on. All right, so here's more traumatic injuries. This is a corneal laceration. This is a severe one that they showed on the internet, and treatment recommendations include tranexamic acid, topical medications, a shield, activity restrictions, or inpatient management or surgical intervention. That looks really unpleasant.
Yeah, it does. It's gotta hurt too, right?
Yes. So for viral, bacterial, and fungal, this is typically for bacterial, that would be more acute. But if it is a viral issue, then that could very well be something that the claimant already had, which there is a case that talks about the herpes virus being in the claimant's eye, which was dormant and then reactivated due to his exposure at work, which we'll go over that. But for the bacterial, the onset is usually probably a day or two when you're exposed to it, and then you wake up with the crusty eyes. So that's something that, I mean, like you said, James, how many people probably have had that and they either didn't claim it or didn't even think about it, getting it at work. All right, so the initial eye care and the treatment recommendations for this is just the antibiotics, depending on the test and what they find out the condition is. And the red flags for these also, they're the same. It's just making sure that there is nothing serious that would cause a serious condition for the claimant's vision. Diagnosing the allergic disorder would be something whether they have allergies, and if it's at work, I can't imagine that there would be much of a, claim if you're working out in the outside and you're allergic to like pollen. I don't know how that would be something that they would be able to claim, but Treatment and medications also include just allergy medication. Chemical burns, these are the more serious if something splashes up into the claimant's face and gives them burns. There is a case where there was acid that came up onto the claimant's whole face and created vision loss. That was an SLU case. They also start with the irrigation. They use irrigating systems for chemical eye exposures. They use the artificial tears, the drops, the patching, and surgical intervention if required. And then this is a condition in the eye that is, we actually have a case for it. It's pterygium is how it's pronounced, and it's an abnormal growth consisting of a triangular fold of tissue that advances progressively over the cornea, usually from the nasal side. So they issue drops for it. And this was actually an interesting case dealing with this condition because the claimant was from Jamaica. And apparently this condition is caused, or it occurs in people who live in tropical climates. And since the claimant did spend most of his life in Jamaica and he traveled here, they basically attributed it to that instead of anything that he was exposed to at work. Or developed at work. He said the doctor testified that it was an overgrowth of conjunctiva onto the cornea that is often seen in individuals who come from sunny tropical countries, much like the claimant who was from Jamaica, West Indies. And it was a chronic condition, so it was disallowed, which was surprising to me. All right, a few additional cases that came up. Did you want to say something?
No.
Oh, okay. I thought you said something. An additional case that came up was this was the claimant who had a recurrent history of herpes that recurred, and it was basically he was exposed to asphalt at work, and this is what prompted his dormant virus to become active again. So it was interesting, and he had already had corneal transplants in the past, so that was attributed to it. However, if it's something that is actually activated as a result of work, you would want to dispute or potentially dispute causation. If that's something that you would have to research. However, if the claimant had a long history of this virus, then you would want to get the history of how often it flared up and whether it was actually caused by anything work related.
I'm kind of wondering, like, if you took all these medicals today and gave them to a doctor, if somebody would still testify that exposure to hot asphalt caused this claimant, to lose his graft. Like, is this just junk science from Dr. Lax? Any doctor can say anything is related to anything at some point and say it with enough, force of reputation, but this seems really attenuated to me.
Yes, agreed. And then also the remaining case law, it dealt with here when he was alleging trauma to the eye, or a foreign body, a rust particle. And it was interesting because the case was disallowed because the claimant alleged that he alleged that rust got into his eye, but it was actually brick. So he had a foreign body and he was just saying, there's rust, and there was actually no exposure to rust at the workplace. It was actually bricks that got into it, or bricks that were there. So they disallowed it due to his lack of credibility. But I don't think there wasn't an actual injury because it was disallowed, but he was alleging that it was rust that got into his eye. So he basically lied and it was disallowed. But overall, the treatment is pretty, it's pretty straightforward, and there's not really a lot of treatment that would be recurrent other than like if it was a viral issue that kept coming up, or if there were any chronic issues that resulted from the work environment. The allergic disorders, which would be seasonal, and also glaucoma, and just the conditions of the eye that are more chronic and require just consistent treatment. But other than that, it's all pretty much seems like it's acute treatment. You clean the eye out, you get the foreign body out, and then there's not much to go by after that. And that's probably why most of the case law is dealing with loss of years. Does anybody have any questions? I know it's really early, so we have a lot of time to discuss.
Well, I'm impressed that you you were able to sort of condense down those 600 pages of guidelines, which were sort of mind-numbing, into a shorter, a shorter presentation. They say brevity is a gift, and I think in this case it was, because when I was reading through those guidelines, I was just my eyes were glazing over, and I was also thinking, man, these doctors are going to be really resentful of this, just having to read everything.
I know. I mean, there's so much information, but I figured you're either going to be putting all of it in there, or you have to really kind of condense it. They seem to repeat themselves a lot.
Well, yeah. And I think from my experience with eye cases, and I had one yesterday, is that the language is very intimidating when we look at eye cases, because we're not really familiar with interpreting those reports that ophthalmologists give us, with the OD and the OS, which is really just a fancy way of saying right versus left. And when you really sort of dive into the permanency guidelines, they're pretty intelligible. If you can sort of parse through and actually decipher the doctor's handwriting, which from my recollection was the most challenging thing in trying to assess the permanency finding that doctors gave me on one of the cases that I handled. It's kind of probably akin to how you're able to handle hearing loss cases now, James, now that you've done many of them and you're very familiar with the language. It's not as imposing for you to handle a hearing loss case as it would be for me to pick one up, because I don't have the familiarity that you do. So I would say, just like anything in our field, if we have the guides there, we have the materials there. These providers aren't rocket scientists any more than we are. Just like they provide, they interpret them wrong and apply them wrong all the time. Don't be intimidated by getting down and dirty with either the treatment guidelines or the permanency guidelines when it comes to an eye case.
And also, it did mention the importance of the claimant's eye history or any ocular injuries, because any incorrect or misleading information can really screw them up. Or screw up their eyesight. So that's really important. It seemed to focus on that a lot. So it seems like claimants will hopefully be honest with their treating providers.
Right.
So Brian is asking whether or not the guidelines cover enucleation, either surgical or traumatic enucleation. I would imagine they do. I know that on the case that I had where I was fighting the permanency finding, the claimant qualified for a 100% schedule loss of use of the eye, even though he still, what was challenging about that case is he could have opted for surgery, which all doctors concluded could have improved his vision, but he went for his permanency evaluation with his non-treated eye, the eye that he didn't elect to have surgery on, and he qualified for 100% schedule loss of use. And he still had, I'm not going to say like his vision was great or anything like that, but in that eye, he definitely still had vision, but he still qualified. So I'm quite certain the guidelines with respect to enucleation must cover that loss of an eye for permanency assessments. I wonder if Brian's asking specifically for the medical treatment guidelines with respect to the eye.
Well, it's only mentioned under subsection E for traumatic injuries and only in passing. So they don't describe it specifically, but they describe it generally under the section of traumatic injuries, and they talk about corneal lacerations, blunt trauma, and then go into treatment. And then obviously the same section describes bacterial fungal infections and corneal ulcers, et cetera. So like section E seems where it is described, but E is really where all the meat is, where you're probably going to spend most of your time under the guidelines, if you're going to hang out in there.
And also for the loss of use, there was one case where he was alleging 100% loss of use, but they did attribute at least 2/3 of the claimant's eye condition or visual impairment to unrelated previous conditions. So then it was rendered a 33.3% loss of use as causally related. So
Wow.
history is something that they take into account that we should keep in mind when we ever do get those loss of uses.
So you'd want to get the claimant's previous records, obviously.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yes. So it just seems a lot of it would be dealing with a lot of eye injuries are from the construction standpoint. But again, especially with metal working, they have to use those safety equipment. So it just probably doesn't actually occur that much. That's why we don't see that many of them.
Right.
So does anybody have any questions? Brian?
I think he's being shy.
Yeah.
No. So, and then also if there is they don't mention the surgical operations too much in the guidelines, but that was one of the areas where post-operative care, but they kind of touch on surgical intervention and then that's it. They don't really talk about the aftercare of it. And there are some charts in here that do show, the viral, bacterial infections that can occur in the eye and what the symptoms are. So
I actually contracted an eye. I don't know if it was a virus or bacteria, but I had keratitis in my eyes, and I was working as a nurse's aide at the time, and I'm quite certain I probably contracted it at work, but I was a dumb teenager and didn't know about workers' comp at the time. But I had to stay off of work for a month because, not necessarily because of my eye, but because I was contagious. So I couldn't work at the hospital
right.
Yeah.
I guess that's what they do describe. They say that viral infections of the eyes are highly infectious. So I guess that probably is going to be the most common claim where you would expect any sort of claim to be filed or lost time or basically any costs involved is somebody that have to isolate themselves from the workplace to avoid spreading it.
It's a weird disability argument too, because my eyes were watery and they stung when I had this keratitis because it basically puts little pits in your cornea. But I could still work, and my eyes, although they watered, it wasn't so debilitating that if I had to go out and find some berries, I bet you I could have gone out and tried to find some berries.
We're not suggesting you be totally disabled, but you might be mildly disabled.
Right, but I was unable to return to work because I was contagious, because I was infectious.
It's an infection injury. It usually affects like the cornea.
Right. Well, I think that was about as much coverage as we can give to the eyes without grossing each other out. Let me look at the chat. Are there any questions in the chat? Let's see. No more questions in the chat. I think that's everything. All right, we're done early, but you know what? It's a Friday. Nobody's going to be upset about that, right?
Nope. Well, enjoy your weekend, everybody. Thank you very much, Melanie and James.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Melanie, for letting me be your friend today.
Thank you for being my friend.
Yeah, you can pay her later.
Yeah, I'll pay you later.